The air inside the courtroom was thick, heavy with the kind of tension that only comes when everyone knows something important is about to unfold. Every seat in the gallery was taken. People pressed shoulder to shoulder as if the trial were the grand event of the season. Yet no one smiled, no one leaned back casually. The atmosphere was too charged, too weighted with the gravity of the case. At the front sat the defendant, a man in his late 30s, his jaw clenched tight, his shoulders hunched forward. He wore a suit, but even with the neatly pressed jacket and tie, something about him seemed out of place, like a wolf dressed in sheep's clothing. His attorney leaned close, whispering something into his ear, but the man barely nodded, his eyes darting across the room as though he were searching for a way out that didn't exist. Near the jury box, 12 men and women sat stiffly, notebooks ready, pens held loosely but firmly, as if they were waiting for one more piece of evidence, one final thread to tie everything together. They'd already heard hours of testimony, sifted through endless stacks of reports and photographs, but something still felt unresolved. Their faces reflected that uncertainty, curiosity, suspicion, and in some cases, outright doubt. At the far end of the courtroom, a little girl sat quietly beside her guardian, a woman in her late 20s who looked just as out of place as the child. The girl couldn't have been more than 3, her hair tied back in 2 neat braids, her tiny hands clutching the edge of the wooden bench, as if it were the only anchor keeping her steady in a sea of strangers. She wore a pale yellow dress with white lace along the collar, a dress meant for Sunday school or birthday parties, not for a courthouse where lives were being decided. No one expected her to be anything more than a silent observer. After all, what role could a child so young possibly play in a trial that had dragged on for weeks? To most of the room, she was little more than a curious presence, an odd note in an otherwise grim melody. And then there was the dog. Rex, a Belgian Malinois, with dark, intelligent eyes and a body honed by years of training, lay near the witness stand, his handler seated beside him. He looked almost statuesque, his chest rising and falling with calm, deliberate breaths, his gaze scanning the room in measured intervals. People were used to seeing police K9 South in the field, at traffic stops, during searches, or patrolling city streets, but rarely did one sit inside a courtroom like another officer of the law. His presence alone drew whispers when the trial began. The judge, a stern man in his 60s with silver hair and a face that seemed carved from stone, sat above it all, presiding over the case with sharp eyes and a steady gavel. He had seen countless trials in his career, everything from petty thefts to high-profile murders, but even he felt a peculiar weight hanging over this one. Though he never admitted such feelings, deep down he knew some trials left scars on everyone who witnessed them. The prosecutor shuffled papers at her desk, her lips pressed into a firm line. She was a woman who prided herself on precision, never entering a courtroom unprepared. Yet even she glanced now and then at the child seated quietly in the gallery, her brow furrowing as though she, too, wondered why the girl had been allowed to stay. The defense team, on the other hand, looked restless. The lead attorney leaned back in his chair, twirling a pen between his fingers, while his assistant tapped nervously on a notepad. They exchanged hurried whispers, occasionally shooting glances toward the jury, calculating, predicting, second-guessing every possible angle. The bailiff, a broad-shouldered man in uniform, stood near the doors, arms folded across his chest. His eyes shifted from the defendant to the jury to the child, then to Rex, the K9, who sat with a stillness that almost felt unnatural. It was the kind of silence that wasn't peaceful, but suffocating. Every cough, every shuffle of papers, every squeak of shoes on the polished floor seemed to echo louder than it should. People leaned forward in their seats, unwilling to miss even a breath of what might happen next. The little girl swung her legs slowly beneath the bench, her shoes not quite touching the floor. She watched everything with wide, curious eyes, not with the detachment of someone who didn't understand, but with the raw, innocent perception of a child who saw things others missed. Her guardian leaned down once, whispering something soothing. But the girl didn't respond. Her gaze was fixed on one spot in the room. On Rex, the canine, as if sensing her stare, lifted his head slightly, his ears twitching. Their eyes met across the space, a strange, silent recognition passing between child and dog. Rex didn't bark, didn't growl, didn't move aggressively, but his focus sharpened. His handler noticed, tugging lightly on the leash, whispering, "Easy, boy." The girl's small hand gripped tighter onto the wooden bench. She whispered something to her guardian, but it was too soft to carry across the courtroom. The woman frowned, brushing it off as nervousness. But the dog didn't brush it off. The stillness of Rex's body became rigid, his breathing deeper, more measured. He lowered his head slightly, eyes locked on the defendant now. His tail, which had lain flat against the floor, gave one sharp thump against the wood. The judge adjusted his glasses, peering down at the papers before him, unaware of the silent exchange happening just feet away. The jury, too, scribbled notes, their attention on the case details rather than the subtleties in the room. But the atmosphere had shifted, almost imperceptibly. Something was building. The defendant must have felt it, because he shifted in his chair, his fingers tapping restlessly against the polished wood of the defense table. His eyes darted toward the K9, then quickly away again, as though he couldn't stand to meet the animal's gaze. The prosecutor glanced toward Rex, her brow creasing. Something about the dog's change in posture unsettled her, though she kept her face calm for the jury's sake. The child, still clutching the bench, leaned forward slightly. Her lips moved again, forming words that no one yet heard. The courtroom remained suspended in that fragile quiet, unaware that within moments the silence would break and everything would change. For now, it was just a child, a dog, and a man who thought he could hide from the truth. But truth has a way of finding its voice, sometimes in the most unexpected of places. And as the gavel struck to call the court back into session, a storm quietly began to gather. The courtroom settled back into order after the short recess, though the tension had never really left. The murmur of voices died down as the bailiff's booming command filled the air. All rise. The judge returned to his bench, his robe, swaying slightly as he sat, adjusting his glasses with practiced authority. Papers shuffled, pens tapped, and the defendant leaned forward, trying to mask his growing unease behind a mask of indifference. Near the front of the gallery, the little girl sat still, her guardian smoothing down her braids with gentle hands. She looked too small for the towering wooden benches, her legs swinging back and forth with the restless energy of a child who should have been anywhere but here. Yet there was something about her eyes, sharp, watchful, older than her years, that made even seasoned lawyers glance at her twice. Across the room, Rex, the police canine, shifted. Until then, he had been the picture of discipline, lying calmly at his handler's feet, alert but restrained. Now, he sat up straighter, his ears erect, gaze fixed not on the judge or jury, but directly on the child. His handler frowned, giving the leash a gentle tug. "Stay," he whispered. But Rex didn't look away. The girl noticed. Her small body stiffened, her little fingers curling around the sleeve of her guardian's blouse. She whispered something, so soft that even the woman holding her had to bend down to hear. "That's him," the girl murmured. The guardian blinked. "Who, sweetheart?" she asked, her tone meant to soothe. The girl's eyes didn't leave Rex. Her lips trembled as she repeated herself. That's him, the dog. Her guardian froze, uncertain of what to make of it. She brushed it off, offering the girl a reassuring smile, but inside her chest a seed of unease planted itself. Why would a 3-year-old react to a police canine this way? The girl's focus sharpened. It wasn't the nervous fidgeting of a child overwhelmed by strangers and stern faces. It was the gaze of someone who recognized, remembered, and connected. Dots she was too young to articulate. At that moment, Rex gave a low rumble in his throat. Not loud, not aggressive, but a sound that carried weight nonetheless. His handler straightened, tightening his grip on the leash. "What is it, boy?" he whispered under his breath, though Rex gave no response, only a steady stare at the child. The defense attorney glanced toward the commotion, his brow furrowing. He leaned toward his client. "Ignore it," he muttered. But the defendant's jaw flexed, his eyes flickering nervously toward the dog before quickly darting away. The prosecutor, always alert to subtle shifts, noticed the exchange. She rose, requesting to approach the bench. After a quiet discussion, the judge reluctantly agreed to allow a brief recess to address an unusual development. Murmurs erupted again, the gallery buzzing like bees disturbed from their hive. The child, as though unaware of the official movements around her, slowly stood. Her guardian tried to guide her back down, but the girl shook her head, her tiny hand pointing first at Rex, then across the room, toward the defendant. The movement drew every pair of eyes. The courtroom hushed once more, anticipation swirling. In the air. "What's she doing?" One juror whispered. "Is she pointing at the dog?" another asked. "She's just a child," someone else muttered, though their voice carried doubt. The girl's small chest rose and fell quickly, her breath shallow as if her body struggled under the weight of memory. She stepped forward, a timid but deliberate movement. Her shoes tapped softly against the polished floor, the sound almost drowned by the sudden thump of Rex's tail against the wood. The handler tugged again, whispering, "Rex, heel." But the dog's focus was unbreakable. His ears twitched, nostrils flaring as if scenting the air for a familiar presence. The prosecutor watched with growing unease. She wasn't one to rely on theatrics or chance. Yet something about this moment felt different, raw, unplanned, undeniable. She could see it in the child's trembling hands, in the way Rex's body vibrated with restrained energy. The judge cleared his throat, his gavel tapping lightly. "Order, order in the court." His stern eyes moved toward the girl. "Miss, please remain seated." But she didn't sit. Instead, her hand rose higher, finger extended with the certainty of someone who could no longer stay silent. "Look," she whispered, her voice still too soft for most to hear. "Sweetheart, sit down," her guardian pleaded, trying to pull her gently back. "No," the girl said firmly. The word rang louder than it should have, snapping heads around, silencing the whispers. She shook her arm free, her eyes locked now on Rex, then flicking quickly toward the defendant again. Her face twisted with something that didn't belong on a child's features, fear mixed with recognition. Rex let out a sharp bark, startling half the room. The handler pulled back hard on the leash, but the dog strained forward, muscles taut. Gaze locked in a straight line, past the girl straight at the defendant. The man at the defense table cursed under his breath, slamming his palm against the polished wood. His lawyer hissed for him to calm down, but the sudden outburst only fed the rising suspicion in the room. The judge's voice boomed, demanding order, but for once, no one seemed to care about the gavel. All eyes were on the child and the dog, on the silent bond that had sparked something none of the adults could control. The girl's guardian looked helpless, her hand hovering over the child's shoulder, but not forcing her down this time. She, too, felt the pull of the moment, the way truth sometimes rises uninvited. The girl's lips moved again. Her voice trembled, but her words this time were just clear enough for everyone nearby to hear. 2 words, barely audible, but enough to make the blood run cold in the veins of those who caught them. The courtroom, unknowingly, had just stepped into uncharted territory. And though the judge, the attorneys, and even the jury didn't yet realize it, the child had just lit the fuse that would explode everything they thought they knew about the case. The unexpected witness was not a trained professional, not a key adult testimony, not even a surprise expert. It was a child. A little girl who had seen too much, and a dog who remembered. The hush that settled over the courtroom was not the polite silence of respect, but the weighted, suffocating kind that presses down on every chest and makes the smallest sounds thunderous. The shuffle of papers stopped. Even the judge's hand froze halfway to his gavel, his sharp eyes narrowing as if he, too, sensed something had shifted. At the very front, the little girl stood rigid, her fingers still raised, trembling in the air like the hand of someone far older than her 3 tender years. The courtroom held its collective breath. Her guardian leaned close, whispering frantic reassurances, but the child didn't seem to hear. She wasn't distracted by the crowd, nor by the stern face of the judge. Her gaze was locked on Rex, the police dog. The Belgian Malinois didn't move at first. His handler tugged on the leash again, whispering a sharp command, "Sit." But Rex remained in place, his body low to the ground, muscles tight, ears pointed forward. His gaze swept from the child to the defendant at the table, then back again. The girl's small voice broke the silence, though at first it came out as little more than a whisper. "Him." The word was soft, almost fragile, yet it cut like a blade. Several jurors leaned forward, squinting as though their ears had deceived them. One of the court reporters glanced up from her machine, uncertain if she'd imagined the child speaking at all. Her guardian flushed, bending lower. "Sweetheart, hush now. We don't talk." But the girl shook her head, her braids swaying with the force of her refusal. She repeated it, louder this time, her finger now clearly pointing, not just at the dog, but following the line of his gaze straight to the defendant. "Him." This time, everyone heard it. Gasps rippled through the room, hushed voices breaking out despite the judge's stern glare. The defendant shifted uneasily, tugging at his collar as though the fabric had grown too tight. His lawyer hissed something in his ear, gripping his arm hard to steady him, but the man's face betrayed his growing panic. Rex moved then. The suddenness of it startled everyone. He rose from his position in a single fluid motion, his claws clicking against the wood. A sharp bark tore from his chest, not playful, not uncertain, but authoritative, a declaration. His handler yanked the leash, straining to pull him back, but the dog lunged forward, his entire body a taut wire of restrained fury. The child flinched, but did not sit. Instead, she took a hesitant step closer, her little shoes tapping softly on the floor. Her eyes brimmed with tears, though her jaw set with surprising firmness. "That's him," she said again, louder now. The judge finally pounded his gavel, the sharp cracks echoing like gunshots in the heavy air. Order. Order in this courtroom. But order was an impossible demand. The gallery erupted into murmurs. The jury whispered in anxious tones, and even the bailiff shifted uneasily, his hand moving closer to his sidearm out of instinct. The prosecutor rose to her feet, her eyes sharp, recognizing what was happening, but unable to stop it. A child turned her full attention to the defendant now. Her little finger pointed directly at him, her words rising above the noise with a clarity that pierced the chaos. "Him. Bad." The defendant slammed his fists against the table, his chair scraping backward with a screech. "This is ridiculous," he bellowed, his voice cracking with barely contained rage. "She's..." A child. She doesn't know what she's saying. But his outburst only fed the fire. Jurors' eyes widened. One of them actually recoiled slightly, as though his anger had confirmed what they'd already begun to suspect. Rex barked again, pulling hard enough that his handler had to brace both feet against the floor to restrain him. His snarls filled the chamber, each one punctuated by sharp, guttural growls that vibrated through the wood and into the bones of every listener. The little girl began to cry, not the wailing sobs of a frightened toddler, but soft, trembling tears that slipped down her cheeks while she refused to back down. She clutched her guardian's hand tightly, but her finger remained raised, her voice breaking as she repeated, "Bad man, bad man." The courtroom descended into chaos. The judge shouted for order again, his gavel slamming over and over. The defense attorney demanded a mistrial, shouting that this spectacle was prejudicial, that it was manipulative, that a child's words could not be taken as evidence. But his voice was drowned out by the collective murmur of disbelief, suspicion, and realization that swept through the room. The prosecutor stood slowly, her expression unreadable. She didn't speak yet, but her eyes locked on the defendant, with a quiet intensity that made him flinch. She had spent weeks struggling to piece together a fragile case, every detail scrutinized, every piece of evidence challenged. And now, in the span of a minute, the ground had shifted beneath them. All because of a child and a dog. The judge rubbed his temples, exhaling heavily. "This court will have order, or I will clear the gallery," he snapped, his tone brooking no argument. Slowly, the murmurs died down, though the charged energy remained. The defendant dropped back into his seat, his face pale, sweat beading across his forehead. He avoided the dog's gaze, avoided the child's, his hands fidgeting restlessly in his lap. His lawyer leaned in again, whispering furiously, but the man's body language betrayed him. He was unraveling. Meanwhile, Rex had quieted slightly, though his growls still rumbled deep in his chest. His handler kept a firm grip, but he didn't reprimand the dog anymore. He knew, as every handler eventually learns, that a dog like Rex never reacted without reason. The little girl finally sank back into her seat, trembling but still staring at the defendant. Her guardian wrapped an arm around her, whispering soothing words. But her small voice carried once more, soft but chilling. "He hurt people." The words weren't shouted, but they rang through the silence that followed like bells tolling at a funeral. And though no official testimony had yet been given, no evidence reintroduced, the trial had already changed. The jury leaned forward, their pens forgotten, their eyes sharpened. The gallery held its collective breath, waiting. For the first time in weeks, the prosecutor felt the weight of momentum on her side. For the first time, the defendant looked cornered, and for the first time, the truth felt dangerously close to breaking free. The signal no one expected had been given, and it came not from evidence, not from lawyers, but from a child's unwavering finger and a dog's unshakable loyalty. The courtroom could never return to what it was before that moment. The fuse had been lit. The explosion was yet to come. The gavel slammed again, sharp and unrelenting, as the judge tried desperately to rein the room back into order. The heavy oak echoed with each strike, but the noise barely contained the waves of whispers, the quickened breaths, and the rattling energy that filled the chamber. Every soul inside the courtroom could feel it now, that something irreversible had begun, and they were powerless to stop it. The little girl was still standing. Her guardian tugged on her sleeve, her voice urgent, trembling. "Sit down, sweetheart, please. Sit down." But the child refused. Her thin arm shook, her finger unwavering as it remained pointed toward the man at the defense table. The defendant had gone pale, his lips pressed into a hard line, his chest rising and falling with shallow, panicked breaths. His eyes darted back and forth between the girl and the dog, like a cornered animal scanning for escape. His lawyer leaned closer, whispering furiously, his words hissing like a snake. "Calm yourself. Do not react. Do not give them anything." But the advice was wasted. The man's jaw flexed, his nostrils flaring as though he were trying to swallow his own rage. Every muscle in his body screamed tension. He looked less like a defendant, waiting for a fair verdict, and more like a predator about to lash out. Rex, the Belgian Malinois, had not stopped watching him. His growl simmered like thunder in the distance, low and steady, vibrating through the wooden floors. The leash pulled taut, his handler straining to keep him in place, but the dog's instincts were unshakable. He knew. Every fiber of his being screamed recognition. The judge leaned forward, his face flushed with irritation. "This is highly irregular," he barked. "The child will be removed if this disruption continues." The prosecutor was on her feet in an instant, her tone urgent but respectful. "Your Honor, with all due respect, perhaps we should," but she didn't get to finish. The little girl's voice broke through, trembling but sharp, the kind of voice that carries even when it isn't loud. Her cheeks were wet with tears, her braids quivering as her head shook with the force of her conviction. She locked her eyes on the man across the room, her lips parting as she finally said it clear, unshakable, undeniable. "Bad man." The words were small, spoken in a child's cadence, but they struck the courtroom like a gunshot. Gasps rippled instantly, echoing off the marble walls. Jurors' jaws dropped. People in the gallery leaned forward in shock, hands pressed against their mouths. Even the bailiff, who had seen his share of drama in the courtroom, stiffened visibly. At the child's declaration, the defendant shot up from his chair, his hands slamming down on the table so hard the wood rattled. "She's lying," he shouted, his voice shrill, cracking under the weight of panic. "She doesn't know what she's talking about. This is absurd." But his protests only deepened the disbelief, only painted him with the color of guilt. His voice didn't sound confident, it sounded desperate. Rex lunged forward at that exact moment, barking with such force that the sound rattled through every rib cage in the room. His handler dug in his heels, straining to hold him back, but the dog's muscles surged with raw energy. His teeth flashed. His eyes locked on the man at the defense table, his fury a mirror of the child's quiet accusation. The girl sobbed harder now, burying her face briefly against her guardian's hip before lifting it again, still pointing with that tiny trembling finger. "He's the bad man," she repeated, louder, her voice rising above her tears. The prosecutor seized the moment, stepping forward with a voice that trembled but carried authority. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, we need to acknowledge what just occurred. Both the child and the canine have independently identified the defendant." The defense attorney erupted, slamming his palm against the table. "This is prejudicial nonsense. She's 3 years old, for God's sake. This is manipulation, theatrics, nothing more." His face flushed with fury, but his client's pale complexion and twitching hands undermined every word. The judges. Gavel slammed again, the sound deafening. "Enough!" he roared, his voice shaking with a rare loss of composure. His eyes swept the room, landing finally on the defendant, who was sweating profusely, his shoulders hunched as though he might fold into himself at any moment. The jurors whispered among themselves, their eyes wide, pens long forgotten. Some scribbled frantic notes, others just stared at the child, then at the dog, then at the man accused. The little girl, trembling but resolute, repeated the words. Again, each syllable steadier, louder, impossible to ignore. "Bad man, bad man." Her guardian wrapped both arms around her, whispering through tears. "Sweetheart, it's okay." But the girl didn't stop. Her small body shook with fear, but her voice refused to falter. The defendant exploded again, his voice shrill, desperate. "This is insane. She's confused. I don't even know her." He jabbed a trembling finger toward the dog. "And that much he's trained to do this. He doesn't know anything." But his words rang hollow. Every eye in the courtroom could see the truth unraveling in real time. His panic, his rage, his inability to contain himself. It was the reaction of a man cornered by a truth he could no longer suppress. The judge sat back slowly, his hand frozen on the gavel, his face grave. He had presided over countless cases in his decades on the bench, but rarely had he witnessed a moment so raw, so unplanned, so undeniably powerful. It wasn't evidence in the traditional sense. It wasn't testimony vetted by law. But it was something else, something primal, something real. The prosecutor's voice dropped low, but it carried through the silent room. "Your Honor, sometimes the truth comes not from professionals, not from experts, but from those who see things with innocent eyes and from those who never forget." Her gaze flicked to Rex, who growled again, his body rigid with focus. The defendant collapsed back into his chair, his chest heaving. He rubbed his temples with both hands, muttering curses under his breath. The girl's voice, softer now, but still audible, whispered one last time, "Bad man?" And in that moment, no matter what the law books said, no matter how the rules of the trial dictated what counted as evidence, the entire courtroom knew. The truth had been spoken, and it had come from the smallest voice in the room. The words "bad man" were still hanging in the air, echoing in everyone's ears when the police canine Rex lunged forward with a suddenness that rattled the entire courtroom. His handler, Officer Daniels, gripped the leash tight, his boots sliding slightly against the polished wooden floor as the powerful German shepherd pulled with all his strength. A low, guttural growl vibrated from Rex's chest, followed by sharp, furious barks that bounced off the walls of the chamber. This wasn't just noise, it was recognition. Rex wasn't barking at the judge, nor the attorneys, nor even the dozens of onlookers filling the seats. His gaze was laser-focused on the defendant, the man sitting rigid at the front, his knuckles white against the defense table. The dog's body quivered with restrained energy, every muscle taut, as though it remembered something too important to ignore. The sudden eruption threw the room into chaos. The jury collectively flinched. Several gasped aloud, hands shooting up to their mouths. A woman in the gallery whispered, "Oh my God," while others craned forward, trying to see what Rex had. Detected. The bailiff instinctively stepped toward the defendant, as if the dog's instinct might justify immediate caution. The judge banged his gavel furiously. "Order! Order in the court!" His voice carried authority, but for once, it wasn't the loudest sound in the room. Rex's growls drowned everything else, his eyes blazing with something deeper than instinct memory. The little girl who had spoken those 2 words clung to her guardian, tears welling in her wide eyes. She trembled, but she didn't take back her accusation. Even through her fear, she seemed to understand what the dog was confirming. "Officer Daniels, control your animal." The defense attorney barked, sweat beading on his forehead, but his voice cracked with panic, betraying the confidence he had carried only minutes earlier. Daniels crouched low, his voice firm yet soothing as he held Rex's harness close. "Easy, boy, easy." His hand pressed against the canine's chest, trying to ground him, but the dog's focus never wavered. His entire body strained toward the defendant, a living arrow pointing to guilt. The defendant slammed his hands down on the table, standing suddenly. "This is outrageous," he shouted. "It's just a stupid dog." The insult seemed to ignite Rex further. His barks intensified, booming so loud the little girl covered her ears. The handler's knuckles whitened as he fought to hold him back. But it wasn't just the dog reacting anymore. The people in the courtroom, jurors, spectators, even seasoned officers, felt something shift. The girl's words and Rex's furious response wove together, too aligned to be dismissed as coincidence. The energy in the room shifted from skepticism to certainty. The prosecutor, quick to seize the moment, stepped forward. "Your Honor, this is not an ordinary reaction. Rex is a trained canine with years of service. He does not bark without reason. He recognizes something here, something about the defendant that can't be ignored." The defense lawyer shot to his feet. Objection. Speculation and theatrics. He was red-faced, his composure crumbling. A dog's growl cannot stand as evidence. This is absurd. The judge hesitated, his gavel hovering above the bench. He had seen countless trials, but never one interrupted by a child's accusation and a dog's instinct converging so powerfully. He studied the trembling girl, then the raging canine, then the pale-faced defendant whose eyes darted nervously, as though searching for an escape. The jury, meanwhile, couldn't look away. Their pens had stopped scratching notes. Every eye was locked on Rex and on the man the dog was trying desperately to reach. For several tense moments, the courtroom was a battlefield of silence, broken only by the sharp growls of the K9. The sound reverberated like a warning bell, refusing to be ignored. Finally, Officer Daniels managed to kneel and press his forehead gently against Rex's head, grounding him enough to calm the storm. Slowly, the growls softened, though his body remained tense and unyielding. Daniels spoke quietly into the microphone, his voice steady. "Your Honor, with respect, I need the record to reflect this. Rex has never behaved this way in court. He is disciplined, controlled, and highly trained. The fact that he's reacting this strongly to the defendant, it means something." The defendant's lawyer scoffed loudly, but his client's trembling betrayed him. Sweat slid down his temples, and he pulled at his collar as if the room had grown unbearably hot. His once smug demeanor had cracked wide open. The little girl, still pressed into her guardian's side, peeked up through tear-stained eyes. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried through the microphone. "He's the bad man," she said again, firmer this time. The words seemed to sink deeper, wrapping themselves around the hearts of everyone present. Rex barked once more, short, sharp, and commanding, before finally lowering himself onto his haunches beside Daniels. His eyes, however, never left the defendant. It was as if the K9 was saying, "Don't you dare think you're free. I know who you are." The prosecutor seized the silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have just witnessed something no one can fabricate. The victim, this innocent child, identified the defendant. And the police K9, who was present during the initial investigation, confirms it in the only way he can. That is not coincidence. That is truth." The defense scrambled, stammering objections, demanding mistrial, accusing theatrics. But the damage was done. The jury's expressions told the story. Some leaned back, arms crossed, their skepticism crumbling. Others leaned forward, eyes blazing, silently condemning the man in question. The child's innocence, combined with the K9's raw, unshakable instinct, had cut through every doubt the defense had planted. The judge finally spoke, his tone grave. "This court cannot ignore what has just transpired. The words of this child and the reaction of this police K9 will be entered into the record. It will be considered in the evaluation of testimony and evidence." The defendant slammed his fists on the table again. "This is ridiculous. I won't be convicted by a child's lies and a mutt's barking." His voice cracked, desperation bleeding through. The bailiff stepped forward, standing closer to him now, as if anticipating trouble. And Rex, still seated, let out one more low growl, a sound like thunder rolling in the distance. The little girl pressed her cheek into her guardian's chest, clutching her small hands together. She had spoken her truth, and now the courtroom had heard it. For the first time since the trial began, the weight of the case no longer rested on the adult's arguments alone. It rested on innocence and instinct, the kind that couldn't be rehearsed, bribed, or coached. And for the first time, the defendant looked cornered. His eyes darted from juror to juror, searching for sympathy. But all he found were stares as cold as stone. The courtroom would never be the same after this moment. The little girl's 2 words, and Rex's furious response had changed everything. What had begun as a tense but ordinary trial had shifted into something unforgettable. A story of truth breaking through the cracks, no matter how hard someone tried to bury it. The echoes of the growls and the words "bad man" lingered in every corner of the chamber. And deep down, everyone present knew the case was no longer just about evidence. It was about justice that refused to stay silent. The courtroom had already shifted into a state of unease after the girl's 2 words, "bad man," echoed through the chamber. People whispered in disbelief. Jurors exchanged uncertain glances, and the defendant's face had gone pale. But what came next would not only silence every doubt, but also uncover a truth buried under months of fear and confusion. The prosecutor, a woman seasoned by years of trials, yet visibly touched by the bravery of this tiny witness, stepped forward. Her voice softened as she requested permission from the judge. "Your Honor, with your approval, I'd like to ask the child just one question." The judge, still processing the dramatic turn of events, adjusted his glasses and gave a slow nod. "Proceed carefully," he said, his tone carrying both caution and curiosity. The little girl clutched her guardian's arm, her wide eyes darting from the judge to the prosecutor, and finally to Rex the K9, who had not taken his gaze off the defendant since the moment she had spoken. His growls had quieted, but his body remained stiff, every muscle coiled like a spring. The handler knelt beside him, whispering commands, yet Rex stood alert, as if guarding a secret he could not vocalize. The prosecutor knelt, so she was eye level with the child. Her tone was gentle, almost motherly. "Sweetheart, can you tell me why you pointed at the dog?" The room leaned in, as if the very air itself waited for her answer. The girl's lips trembled, and for a moment, silence stretched long and unbearable. Then she whispered, "Because I saw him." A murmur rippled through the audience. "Saw who?" The prosecutor pressed softly. The girl's tiny hand lifted, pointing not at Rex this time, but at the defendant sitting at the defense table. Her voice cracked as she said, "I saw him. Outside my house at night." Gasps erupted, the jury shifting forward in their seats, attorneys rising in protest. The defense lawyer sprang to his feet, shouting, "Objection! This is outrageous. She's a child. She doesn't understand." But before the judge could respond, the girl spoke again, louder this time. "And the dog was there too." The words landed like a thunderclap. For a moment, the courtroom froze. Then, all eyes turned to Rex. The K9's ears flicked forward, his tail stiffened, and he barked sharply once, as though confirming her memory. The handler's eyes widened, his grip on Rex's collar tightening as he realized what this meant. The judge struck his gavel, restoring order. "Silence. The court will have order." His voice boomed, but even he leaned slightly forward, compelled by the revelation. The prosecutor stood, her voice gaining strength. "Your Honor, if I may, this is not just a child's imagination. Officer Daniels, Rex's handler, can confirm details that align with what the child is saying." All eyes turned to the handler, a veteran officer who rarely spoke during trials. He rose slowly, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, Several weeks ago, Rex and I were deployed near the girls' neighborhood. There had been a report of a late-night break-in attempt. Rex alerted near a vehicle parked 2 houses down from the girls' residence. That vehicle, at the time, was registered to the defendant. The courtroom exploded into murmurs. The jurors whispered, their skepticism fading into something far heavier realization. The defense attorney barked back, circumstantial. The vehicle could have been anywhere, but the handler interrupted firmly. With respect, sir. Rex doesn't alert without reason. And now, hearing this girl's testimony, it makes sense. Rex must have recognized the scent, connected it, and never forgot. K9 South don't forget their targets. The judge rubbed his forehead, clearly shaken. What had begun as a trial filled with uncertainty had now taken a sharp turn, guided not by legal arguments, but by a child's memory and a dog's unshakable loyalty. The little girl clung tighter to her guardian, tears rolling down her cheeks. Yet her courage did not waver. She looked back at Rex, who had now calmed slightly, and whispered, "He saved me." The words struck like an arrow to the heart. The prosecutor knelt again. "What do you mean, sweetie?" The girl sniffled. "That night, I saw the man in the dark. I was scared, so I stayed by the window. He came close. But then the dog barked. He barked so loud, and the man ran away." The courtroom collectively held its breath. The handler's voice was low, almost choked. That was Rex. He was the one who scared the intruder off that night. We never knew there had been a child awake inside. Until now. The judge's hand trembled slightly as he adjusted his papers. This was no longer a simple trial. It was unraveling into something undeniable, something personal, something raw. The defense scrambled, their words frantic. "Your Honor, this is emotional manipulation. The child is confused. The dog is just reacting to noise." But even as they spoke, the jury's eyes told another story. They had seen the sincerity in the child's trembling voice, the undeniable recognition in Rex's reaction, and the sudden fear that had consumed this defendant. The prosecutor's voice rose with newfound fire. "Your Honor, this is not manipulation. This is truth. This child has no agenda, no reason to lie." She identified not only the defendant, but also the very K9 who protected her. That is not coincidence. That is evidence no one expected. The judge looked out across the silent chamber, his gavel resting heavily in his hand. Finally, he spoke. "This court cannot ignore what has been revealed. Proceed." The jury shifted, eyes fixed on the defendant, whose confident facade had shattered. Sweat rolled down his temple, his lips pressed into a thin line. He had no words, no alibi, strong enough to counter the combined force of a child's memory and a dog's instincts. And in that moment, the hidden truth that had eluded everyone for so long had finally emerged. The audience, the jury, even the judge knew it. Justice had just found its voice in the most unexpected of ways. The courtroom was no longer the same place it had been that morning. What had begun as a routine session filled with legal arguments had turned into something far larger, an emotional battlefield where truth clawed its way to the surface. The little girl's trembling words had shifted the tide, and the German shepherd Rex seemed almost to stand as her guardian, a silent witness carrying memories that no human could erase. The defendant, once confident, now sat hunched over, his knuckles white against the wooden table. He avoided the child's gaze, but his darting eyes betrayed him, eyes that seemed to search for an escape that didn't exist. The judge leaned back in his chair, his face drawn tight with concern. For years, he had presided over cases that blurred the line between innocence and guilt, but rarely had he seen truth surface in such an unorthodox way. "We will continue," he said firmly, his gavel echoing through the chamber. "But let The records show the testimony given by this child cannot be dismissed lightly. The prosecutor rose again, her voice steady, though her hands trembled with the weight of the moment. She glanced at the girl, then at Rex, then back to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, what you have just witnessed is not theatrics. It is the raw truth. A child, uncoached, unprovoked, identified the man who brought terror into her life and the dog who protected her. These are not coincidences. They are connections. The jury members leaned in, listening intently, their expressions somber. The defense attorney scrambled, his voice laced with desperation. Your Honor, this is improper. We cannot allow a 3-year-old's confused memories to dictate a man's future. But his words were drowned beneath the weight of what everyone had seen: the sudden recognition, the fear in the defendant's eyes, and the way Rex had responded, as if validating her every word. The prosecutor ignored the outburst, turning instead toward Officer Daniels, Rex's handler. Officer, can you explain why Rex might have reacted so strongly when the child pointed to the defendant? Daniels stood, straightening his uniform. His voice was low but unwavering. Rex is trained to recognize scents tied to criminal behavior. Once a scent is imprinted, he doesn't forget it. If Rex reacted, it's because he remembered. It means that this man, he pointed at the defendant, was present at the scene where Rex last caught that trail. The defendant's lawyer jumped to his feet again. Speculation. Dogs can react to anything, but the judge cut him off. Sit down, counselor. This court will hear the officer out. Daniels continued, his eyes never leaving the jury. I have served alongside Rex for years. He has tracked fugitives across miles of forest. He has located missing children in storms. He has never once misidentified a suspect. Not once. His voice hardened. When Rex reacts this way, I trust him more than I trust most men. Heavy silence fell across the room. The jury's pens scratched slowly across their notepads, and whispers began to ripple through the gallery. The little girl, emboldened by Rex's unwavering presence, lifted her small chin. He's not a good man, she said softly, pointing again at the defendant. Her voice trembled, but her words rang clear, cutting through the tension like a blade. He wanted to hurt us. The prosecutor placed a hand over her heart as the weight of those words settled. She turned to the jury. Out of the mouths of children comes truth. And today you have witnessed it with your own eyes. The judge exhaled deeply, pressing his fingers to his temples. We will recess for 1 hour, he announced. His gavel struck once more. Court adjourned until then. The crowd buzzed with disbelief as people stood, filing out into the hallway. Voices raised in heated whispers. But inside the courtroom, the atmosphere remained heavy. The girl sat quietly, hugging her stuffed toy, her guardian holding her close. Rex lay at her feet, calm now, his head resting on his paws, his amber eyes never once leaving the defendant. Even as officers prepared to escort him from the chamber, the defendant shifted, his voice barely audible as he muttered to his lawyer, "We need to end this, now." His knuckles were pale, his jaw tight. The lawyer tried to calm him, but the man's panic was spreading like cracks across glass. The prosecutor observed from a distance, her instincts sharpening. She recognized the look on his face-cornered fear, the kind of fear only guilty men wore when their lives had run out of places to hide. Outside in the corridor, reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. Did the little girl just solve the case? One shouted. Is the dog really the key witness? Another asked. Inside, the guardian knelt to eye level with the girl. You were so brave, she whispered. Do you know that? You were stronger than all of us today. The girl's lip quivered. But will he come back? She asked, her voice trembling. The guardian hugged her tight, No, sweetheart, not anymore. You've told the truth. And the truth is stronger than him. As the recess stretched on, whispers of plea deals, new evidence, and reopened files began to stir among the legal teams. The prosecutor pored over the case documents with renewed energy, her eyes scanning for any connection that could tie the girl's revelation to hard evidence. She knew the jury already leaned toward belief, but belief needed to be anchored. In fact, then, as though fate intervened, an officer hurried into her chamber with a folder clutched in hand. "Ma'am," he said, breathless, "we just pulled an older file related to that night." A surveillance camera across from the girl's neighborhood caught a glimpse of a man leaving the area. The image is grainy, but the height, build, and vehicle matched the defendant. The prosecutor's heart raced. The timing was no accident. The girl's words had unlocked doors no one thought to open before. Now, with this new lead, the pieces began to fit together like shards of a puzzle finally aligning. When court resumed, the prosecutor stood with fresh determination. She held the folder high. "Your Honor, before we proceed, new evidence has come to light, evidence that corroborates the child's testimony." A camera placed opposite the child's home captured footage on the night of the incident. While unclear in detail, it shows a man of the defendant's stature leaving in a car identical to his. Gasps rose again. The defense attorneys, face drained of color. The jury leaned forward, their pens scratching furiously. The defendant slammed his hand against the table, his composure fracturing. "That doesn't prove anything," he barked, sweat shining on his forehead. But his outburst only deepened the impression of guilt. The judge raised a brow, unimpressed. "Counselor," he said to the defense, "do you wish to continue denying every thread of evidence? Or will you allow your client to speak for himself?" The defendant froze. His lawyer whispered urgently into his ear, but the man shook his head. For the first time, his silence was louder than any denial he could give. And there it was, the turning point. The courtroom, the jury, the public, everyone could feel it. Truth had clawed its way out of shadows, carried not just by evidence, but by the voice of a child and the loyalty of a dog who never forgot. The trial was no longer about reasonable doubt. It was about the undeniable weight of truth. And in that moment, the little girl reached for Rex's fur, whispering, "We did it." The shepherd lifted his head, his amber eyes glowing. With something unspoken, something eternal. He had guarded her before, and now, with the world finally listening, he had guarded her again. The atmosphere in the courtroom was so heavy that every breath seemed amplified, every movement magnified. The jury had been out for only 2 hours, but for those waiting inside, it felt like an eternity. The little girl sat quietly with her guardian, clutching a small stuffed rabbit that someone from the clerk's office had offered her earlier. Rex, the loyal canine, lay on the floor nearby, his large brown eyes scanning the room with quiet vigilance. Even in stillness, the dog seemed to command attention, his presence reminding everyone of the turning point they had witnessed. When the jury doors finally creaked open, the room collectively stiffened. 12 solemn faces filed in, their expressions firm, betraying little of what they had decided. The foreman clutched a folded piece of paper in his hand. As they took their seats, all eyes turned to the judge, who sat tall and composed, though even his features betrayed a hint of anticipation. "Members of the jury," the judge began, his voice echoing off the paneled walls, "have you reached a verdict?" The foreman stood, clearing his throat. "We have, Your Honor." He unfolded the paper with deliberate care, as though aware the entire courtroom was holding its breath. The defendant shifted in his chair, his eyes darting wildly. His hands gripped the table so tightly, his knuckles turned white. The air smelled faintly of sweat, of tension so sharp it was almost physical. The girl buried her face briefly into her guardian's sleeve before daring to peek up again. Rex raised his head, his ears pricking, as though even he sensed the gravity of what was about to be spoken. The foreman's voice rang out, steady and clear. On the charge of aggravated burglary, we find the defendant guilty. Gasps rippled across the room, but he wasn't finished. On the charge of attempted assault with a deadly weapon, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of child endangerment, guilty. The final word seemed to hang in the air like a thunderclap. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick, full of emotion, disbelief, and release. The defendant's shoulders collapsed, his earlier defiance draining away as though the strength had been ripped from his body. His attorney lowered his head, resigned. The judge lifted his gavel, but did not strike it down just yet. Instead, he paused, his eyes drifting toward the little girl who had unknowingly become the trial's most pivotal witness. "Order in the court," he said softly, his voice tinged with something that sounded almost like reverence. Order. Finally, he struck the gavel once, sharp and final. The courtroom had its verdict. For the first time that day, the little girl allowed herself a small smile. She didn't fully understand the words, guilty or verdict, but she understood something deeper. The bad man, the one she had recognized, the one who had haunted her nights, wouldn't be able to hurt her anymore. In her child's mind, that was enough. Rex, sensing her relief, rose to his feet and walked toward her. His handler gave a small nod, loosening the leash, allowing the dog to approach. The room seemed to melt away as the German shepherd lowered his massive head gently onto the child's lap. She let out a small giggle through her tears, her tiny fingers burying into the thick fur around his neck. "You saved me," she whispered softly, words meant only for him. But in that room, it felt as though everyone heard it. The judge cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. "Before we conclude," he said, his gaze moving across the courtroom, "I believe it is important to acknowledge that justice was not served by evidence alone. Today, courage came from unexpected places. A child and a dog reminded us of the simplest truth, that innocence has a voice and loyalty never lies." His words struck deeply. Jurors nodded silently, some blinking back tears. The prosecutor, who had fought tirelessly for this moment, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Even the court reporter, usually mechanical in her recording, paused briefly to wipe her glasses. The defendant was led away in shackles, his protests muted now, his power broken. He avoided the girl's eyes, perhaps out of shame, perhaps out of fear, but it didn't matter anymore. The weight of the law and the truth had caught up with him. As the courtroom emptied, a small crowd gathered near the front. Reporters whispered frantically into their recorders, but none dared disturb the child or the dog. It wasn't just a story to them now. It was a moment of humanity that transcended headlines. The prosecutor approached the girl and her guardian, kneeling down so she was at eye level. "You were very brave today," she said gently. "Do you know that?" The little girl nodded solemnly, clutching Rex's collar as though it were an anchor. "Can I tell you a secret?" the prosecutor added, lowering her voice. "Rex thinks you're a hero." The girl's eyes widened, and for the first time in days, her laughter bubbled up, light and unburdened. "Really?" "Really," the prosecutor confirmed, smiling. "And so do I." The guardian's eyes filled with tears, gratitude etched into every line of their face. For weeks they had feared that the child's voice would be too small, too fragile, to matter. But today had proven otherwise. Her innocence, paired with Rex's unshakable loyalty, had pierced through layers of lies and doubt. As they left the courtroom, sunlight streamed through the high windows, casting golden beams onto the marble floor. The little girl walked hand in hand with her guardian, Rex padding loyally beside them. For the first time in a long time, the world didn't feel so frightening. Outside, the steps of the courthouse buzzed with life cameras flashing, onlookers gathering, voices rising. But in the midst of the chaos, a hush followed the small trio. No one dared approach too closely. It was as if everyone collectively agreed that this moment belonged to them, not to the media or the noise of the world. The little girl paused on the steps, looking up at the sky. "Is it over now?" she asked softly. Her guardian knelt beside her, brushing hair from her face. "Yes, sweetheart, it's over." Rex leaned against her leg, his warm weight a living reassurance. The story spread quickly in the days that followed, reaching far beyond the courthouse walls. Headlines spoke of the child in K9 who changed a trial. Communities whispered about the bravery of a little girl who had stood tall without even realizing it. Letters of support and gifts arrived at the guardian's home. Handwritten notes from strangers thanking the child for reminding them that courage can come in the smallest forms. But none of that mattered to her. What mattered was simple. The bad man was gone, and the good dog was still by her side. Months later, the memory of that day lingered, but in a gentler way. The little girl still spoke of Rex often, sometimes in whispers as though he were her secret protector. She slept more soundly now, nightmares fading into the past. And whenever she visited the station with her guardian, Rex would bound toward her with unrestrained joy, a bond forged in truth and innocence unbreakable by time. For the officers, the trial became a story they carried with pride, a reminder that their work was not just about laws and evidence, but about lives touched and saved. And for the judge, the memory of that child's voice saying, "Bad man," remained the most powerful testimony he had ever heard. In the end, justice had not been delivered by the law alone, but by the purity of a child's heart and the unwavering loyalty of a dog. Together, they had done what no one else could. And as the courthouse clock struck that evening, its deep chimes echoing across the city, it was as though those sounds carried the truth far and wide. Sometimes, the bravest voices are the smallest ones.